children born into cults and left. What was your oh shit moment? My brother and I grew up in a cult family. Not specifically naming anything, but has since disbanded to my knowledge, though some of you all might know which town this happened in. Picture this, a rural town, middle of nowhere with only a handful of people. It was made very clear that outsiders weren't welcome, and we obviously didn't get many guests. The ones that stumbled upon it were lost. The town looked creepy as shit, so they cleared out fast. Contact to the rest of the world was non-existent, and we didn't have access to anything, no news, TV, etc. Here are some of the worst things that are burned into my memory. Live animal sacrifices were common. On special occasions, leaders cut them open and followers were required to eat a piece of the heart. One time, I threw up after the ceremony and was beaten. People got sick frequently, but weren't permitted to see a medical professional outside of the cult, but the doctors in the cult were absolute quacks. Education was handled by leaders, and whoever they appointed. My older brother really liked dragonflies and other insects. Our dad would capture them and force him to pluck the wings off as a sacrifice. It was typical for the members to be having sex with each other, consensual or not. Leaders and their favorites were allowed to rap. My brother and I knew our real parents, but we were taught to treat every adult as a parent. They turned a blind eye to the molestation of children. They would marry us teen/kids off informally to people within the cult. When I say informally, I mean there was no gov/legal work to back it up. We were just told that we would be marrying this person and didn't have a choice. I had a romantic and semi-sexual relationship with a teenage boy in the cult. I was slightly younger than him at the time. I became overly paranoid because it was against our religion to be engaging in same-sex relations. For a long time I thought I was going to die since he disappeared one day with no warning. I still have no idea what happened, if he got out by ditching in the middle of the night like I did, or if he was killed. Edit for clarification. I don't know what happened to my parents, but they are probably dead. I haven't seen my brother since that day. I have no way of contacting him if he's alive, and I don't even know where he'd be. I did enlist in the army, and the recruiter who got me in, the friend previously mentioned, worked his ass off with helping me get legal documentation. I gave him all the personal information I knew. We reached out to hospitals in the state, and eventually a document with my last name and parents popped up. I was fortunate enough to be in a state that only needed a statement that said you were that person in order to get a birth certificate. The recruiter also helped me obtain a student ID so I could get the other documentation I needed, social security card, etc. Note it wasn't an immediate transition from cult to military, though I understand why some of you might have thought that. Thank you to you/Ionosphere for the Reddit gold. I'm the daughter of a pastor. My big realization moment was when I was about 11 and my mother didn't let me wear a pretty dress to the Christmas service because red and black will make men look at you in a bad way, and I was like, what the fuck mom, these people go to your church and you think they're creeps. I didn't actually say anything until I was 17 and on family vacation, and my mother told me not to wear my bikini that I had snuck along because my dad and brothers were there. I asked her why. Did she think they would rap me? Got banned from the pool that day. I refused to leave my room for the rest of the trip except for meals. That was the last time they had any kind of control over me. I have more stories. If people would like me to share, edit. Stories are posted in this comment thread. Thank you for your support and interest. I'm having a lot of fun telling them. Sorry for the long links. I'm on mobile. Story 2. One of my best friends today was raised into a freaky Afro-Islamic cult. He and his mom left when his dad was sent on a mission to Sudan. As it turned out, he was sent to fight in a civil war on behalf of the local tribe/cult. They never heard from him ever again. They assume he was killed in action. He described his childhood as animal sacrifices, usually goats, every Friday, and he was forced to eat the heart raw and drink the blood, else he would be beaten. The cult owned a house-turned-apartment building in Detroit where he lived, and said that his mother was never permitted to leave the building. He described how female genital mutilation was mandatory for all girls, which is especially sheeted up. Crazy to think of these kinds of things happening in the United States. When he was 8, He and his mom managed to escape the cult by stealing thousands of dollars in cash and fled in the middle of the night and paid a truck driver to smuggle them into Canada. They stayed in the country illegally for a month, slowly making their way from Ontario to British Columbia, where they smuggled themselves back across the border into Washington. There, they got support from a mosque, who set his mom up with a place to live and a job at a restaurant, and helped get my friend back into the school system and back into society. 4 years they were paranoid as shit because they thought that the cult was going to hunt them down and kill them, but being dressed head to toe in a burqa has its advantages. I guess she was able to hustle up the job, and through financial support from the mosque he was able to attend college, where we met. He's working at a bank now and doing really well for himself. He's getting married soon, and he's fully supporting his mother as well. I don't think I ever truly believed, but the moment that was cemented for me was when I had the unfortunate experience of going on a mission trip to Cambodia. Long story short, 2 teams from the church I had previously attended were sent. For the first 2 weeks the teams were sent to different locations. During this time we helped the local communities, and it was actually pretty nice. Normal prayer sessions etc. However, during the last couple days of the trip both teams met up and stayed in the same location. It was then that stories from the other team about being possessed by the devil, spiritual enlightenment, tongues, becoming a vessel for God to speak through, and being struck down by the love of God were mentioned by the other team. Keep in mind, till that point our team just had your good old regular fashion prayer sessions. Surprise surprise, later that night, when both teams held a joint prayer session, members from my team started hysterically yelling, crying out for God, passing out on the ground, and it was at that moment when I realized that it was all bullshit and pretty much mass hysteria mixed in with an enlightenment dick measuring contest. My mother and I had a conversation about how cute babies are, and she mentioned that the sweet, innocent, lovable nature of infants makes a mother forget the nearly lethal experience of the labor. She kissed my cheek and called me angel. I asked her why, then, I was born, if my elder brother's birth was so terrifying and painful for her. Deuteronomy 5:16 roughly says that children who honor their father and mother, as God says, therefore honoring God too, will be blessed, and the parents are therefore blessed by having a respectful child. In the cult, job descriptions and qualifications include scriptures. My father wanted a job, and one of the requirements was that his children respect him and fear the Lord. But he only had one child at the time. He was told he would not get the promotion until he had another child, and my mother was accosted several times, being told she was selfish, a hellish woman, worse than Eve, that her vagina was a hole to hell. That is not an exaggeration. It was a common insult in the cult, along with calling others uncircumcised and haughty, because people in cults speak with marked peculiarity. She had several panic attacks, and finally stuck off to find a psychiatrist and renew her use of the anxiety medication she was on before my father made her stop taking them. Once I was conceived, my father was promoted, and they were transferred to what was at the time the USSR. My brother was left with, honestly I don't know who, and my parents won't tell me, but they left for the remainder of her pregnancy. Against medical advice, they flew back to the US, and I was born in Illinois. For the next 5 years we were left with strangers, who were ranked highly enough in the cult to take care of the children of my father's ranking, until we were assigned secondary parents. Give about 13 years, and I had a secret and god-awful boyfriend who did not understand consent, but then again neither did I. Well, one day I walked home after a rough date, and upon going to the bathroom I found blood, and realized it was nowhere near my period time. I told my mother, and she said, "That is what happens with men," and went to her room. The next Friday I felt so disgusting that I wanted to purge myself, die to myself, and give my life to the cult. So I confessed everything about how impure I was to the female leaders. One told me I know nothing of pain, and because of my father's ranking I lie for attention. The other said she would not trust me to hold her own child, which is a very insulting this to tell any female who has menstruated, as it is your primary function in the cult to care for your own and other children. It is worse than telling someone that their very existence is inherently meaningless. And the third said my presence was detrimental to the souls of those around me, so I'm to leave and not return. And since I'm a liar, of anyone fully in the cult ask me what happened to lie, or they will say I'm a hoe and a liar. I missed the next 3 periods until one day I was sitting in our living room in an expensive house in Southern California paid for by the forced tithe of those who could barely feed their own children, and I started to bleed. A lot. And then vomit. And then I could barely crawl, so I laid in the bathroom until it was over. I thought I was going to die, and I was happy about it. I woke up in the bathroom, cleaned up, and went to school. My secondary sister snuck me pain meds from the medicine cabinet. Father is prone to migraines. I told my parents what happened that Thursday. My mother started crying, but my father stopped her. She said that, right after she had my brother, she conceived again, twins. But she lost them, bled them out like a curse. My father told her that she had killed the wrong child, and they left me to process it. I didn't have any tears or anger, just sort of a sharp clarity that since hadn't left me. They later told me they were proud of me because I didn't cry, but needed time to process the death of the wrong daughter. In case you want more reading, International Church of Christ, ICC/COC/ICOC. There are plenty of articles and documentaries. I have countless more stories if you'd like. Edit, spelling. The moment when I ask myself, what, fundamentally, the difference between my church and North Korea was, my thoughts went something like this. We sing songs about allegiance to the Supreme Leader. We have pictures of Supreme Leader in our house. We ascribe supernatural events to Supreme Leader. Supreme Leader can do no wrong. One day, we will invade false Korea. Jesus will come and kill all our enemies. Sometime soon, as of last century week. Leaving church. Best Korea. Where will you go? Horrible things outside. People who leave best Korea are evil traitors. Take extra time out of your day to serve best Korea, the church. Anyway, I highly recommend this as a thought process as to whether or not a part of religion is bad. If via substituting nouns it sounds like something out of North Korea, or from a true external perspective, hard to do. It seems strange. It probably is. That's how I left. Incidentally, I've had run-ins with Mormons from time to time. I stole stuff I liked from them until I realized that I was basically building Baha'i again. So I'm mostly aligned with Baha'i now, but more heavily Zoroastrian, I suppose. Despise rituals. But that's my story. So, this story will take a minute to get to where it connects to yours, but please go with me on this ride. I have a friend who was adopted. He was curious about where he came from, but when he looked into finding out about it, he was told that it would cost a couple of $1,000s to hire a private investigator to track down the information. My friend didn't have the money to spare. Last year, his wife got him a DNA testing deal for Christmas, or his birthday or something, I forget, so he could at least figure out what his cultural history was. He got the results back and was looking through all the information online, and lo and behold, they matched his DNA with somebody else who'd bought their kid and sent it in. The guy was his cousin. He contacted the guy, told him his story. The guy talked to his parents and got back with my friend. Come to find out, my friend's biological parents are currently married, and he has 3 full-blooded brothers. They gave him up for adoption because his mother got pregnant with him before she and the father married, and my friend's father was a JW, so he could have been excommunicated if anyone found out he was having sex before marriage. After he found out about that, he looked into JW and confided to me that, while he may have missed out on some things, he certainly lucked out not growing up as a JW. Like others, my experience maybe wouldn't be categorized as a true cult, but the whole think like the herd and don't question God's plan really made me feel like it. It was a fairly mainstream religion, but so robotic and hypocritical I'd still consider a sheeted up way to be. The things that started it for me was a teacher at the private school run by the church, insisting, rather cruelly, that my pets can't go to heaven because they have no souls. I was 6 and felt like it was just a heartless thing to do. Also, the sexism. This was reflected in the dress code policy, the whole idea that girls carry the responsibility to be wholesome and not tempting in any way by wearing long skirts, no sleeveless shirts, etc. Also, the teacher saying mean and hurtful things to students body shaming, before it was ever called that, or thin-built girl for being too skinny, making fun of the poor kids for being less well-kept than the other students, bad-mouthing students publicly, humiliating corporal punishment. I have no idea where the religious messages of Jesus' love fit in there, because I sure didn't hear it much. Only the abuse from the pious staff. Edit. Oh seat, I just remembered. They spouted a lot of soon you'll be required to take the mark of the beast, an implant in your hand or forehead, but you must resist and be willing to die for the church. I only recently found out that the whole mark of the beast thing was based on a totally hypothetical fictional film from the 70s some pastor made, who later said it was a work of fiction, but by then it was already too late and many fundamentalist church groups took it and ran with it. I always imagine a cult as people wearing dark robes and chanting around an altar for something a little sinister, so I'm not really sure what qualifies as a cult, but this might point qualifiers right now. I'm a Methodist, which is a pretty low-key Christian denomination. I've never been to a church with a priest, always a preacher. I dated a girl a while ago whose family were longtime members of what one might label a very fundamentalist Christian sect. As far as I know, the only members of this group are in this one city in Texas, where we both lived at the time, and it's a very Christian city with a little bit of a history with extremist Christian groups. Her stepfather was normally pretty curt to her mother whenever I saw them together, and according to her he was pretty verbally abusive to her when others weren't around. Her group's priest, when she went to him for some counseling on leaving him, told her to just love him and suffer through it, because that's what their scripture said. Their whole group was pretty heavily in on women, remain subservient to men in all scenarios. Now, for the definitively cult-y things, their scripture was the Bible, but cherry-picked to get rid of some things, and with a few extra books, added that their priest had stuck in, because he'd had visions that told him to do so. The members needed permission from the priest to leave the church, and they had to do a period of counseling with him before even looking into a separation, much less an actual divorce. They had a few homes where college-age kids in the church could live together while going to the local university. The students who were around when I was in school weren't bad people as far as I can tell, just a little hipster-y. They did have mandated worship and prayer time every single morning. My girlfriend lived there for a year before we dated because the rent was super low, and she later said that they really freaked her out. My family broke off from the main LDS church in the 60s or 70s because it wasn't conservative enough for them. I don't know if I'd fully categorize it as a cult, but it was bad. Really bad. Most Mormons I know now and have talked to about it are flabbergasted by it. They cherry-picked rules and ideas from a bunch of various conservative movements, but most of our religious ideology was based around Mormonism. I knew I had to get out when Matthew Shepard got murdered, and my parents considered his killers to be doing the Lord's work. As a very young boy who already knew he was gay, it was a rude awakening that they considered murderers in the right over a gay guy who hadn't done anything wrong. I waited it out until college. Somehow, I managed to convince my parents to let me go to a secular school states away. I came out and was told I needed to quit school and come home for an ex-gay program or be kicked out of the family, and chose the latter. I haven't spoken to any of my family in years outside of an uncle who escaped as well. Except once, when my sister called to inform me my mother died, then asked for money to help pay for a funeral I wasn't allowed to attend. I told her I wouldn't do it unless me and my fiance could go, and she hung up on me. I do creep on my cousin's Facebook though. She married a guy who is a normal Mormon, apparently, and is now allowed to use the internet. Except for her, every member of my family I've seen in pictures looks miserable. Oh man. Here's my time to shine. I was born into a radical Pentecostal church during the early 80s and 90s, when exorcism was a thing. They would perform these during church and home groups on Sunday nights. It was always interesting to watch, because the people would go all out, talking in a different demon voice, ushers needing to hold them down, and convulsing on the floor. It was Sunday night, and I was at our youth pastor's house for home group. I was 14. After the singing and praise, the youth pastor started his speech. There's someone here who's been backsliding away from God. They've changed and seem to have Blah blah blah. I remember thinking, oh, who's it going to be today? And that's when I heard my name called, and, can you please come to the middle? Definitely took me off guard, but like a good sheep I went. Everyone gathered around me, started putting hands on me, and speaking in tongues. Then the youth pastor placed one hand on my back, and the other on my stomach. As it started to kick off, getting louder and louder. That's when the youth pastor started to give me the Heimlich. Basically getting his hand all up under my ribcage. It hurt and only got worse. I was thinking to myself, how the hell am I going to get out of this? So, I faked being slain in the Holy Spirit, and fell to the ground. I stayed still and everyone backed off, and continued praising the Lord. What felt like an eternity, I was grabbed by the arms and they moved me to a different room. I waited a bit longer, and finally got up, and left. I haven't been to church since I'm 39. I didn't grow up in a cult, but I did grow up cult adjacent. My parents were long-term missionaries, meaning they did it all the time, not like 6-month or even 2-year stints, and part of a missionary team. There were 3 other families on their missionary team too. A culty one was normal. I mean, normal for someone who is dedicating their lives, and their children's lives in part, to living in a foreign country to indoctrinate the natives. But, yeah, no, it's all relative. The first time I clearly remember thinking beaches be crazy was when I was in 2nd or 3rd grade. The mom of one of the crazy families was teaching Sunday school. Sunday school that day consisted of the mom, me, my sister, and maybe another boy. She was lecturing us about secular music versus godly music. Except it wasn't about the lyrics, it was about the actual music. Not, like, rock music or drums are bad. Nope, that I would have been like, well, that's disappointing but okay. Instead, she was going on and on about how songs that didn't definitively end, I guess songs that faded out, would get stuck on your head, and you'd repeat them over and over without meaning. Which was bad because chanting, I think, chanting was of the devil, and spells used chanting, and the devil would control your mind that way. And then there was a whole thing about a certain number of beats being sinful, but as I was very young, tone deaf, and literally don't even like music, I just fully zoned out at this point and just smiled and nodded at the appropriate points. But I distinctly remember thinking she was insane, just well and truly nuts. I was pretty concerned about her level of crazy, because I told my dad about it. And he was like, don't worry about it, you don't have to believe that. Which of course leads to the thought, if we don't have to believe that, what else do we not have to believe? Turns out a lot of it, when you grown up to be a heathen. Late to the party, but I wanted to participate. I was born into the Mormon cult. I never got into it, despite growing up in it for 17 years. Never truly believed any of it, just went along with all the nonsense. To make my life easier to answer your question, my oh shit moment, the moment I realized it's actually a cult, not a religion, was when I was 17, and I reread my patriarchal blessing for sheets and giggles. I had already told my mom I was an atheist a few months prior to this. She didn't take it well, but I pulled out the letter one day. It reads like an indoctrination contract. If you don't know what this thing is, it's because no one is supposed to talk about them. They are private blessings you receive that usually you'd only share with a parent or sibling. To get your blessing, you go to the stake patriarch when you're old enough, 16 I think, maybe younger. I got mine late. You go to this old cheater's home where places his hands on your head and spouts drivel for a few minutes, in my case, while his wife transcribed it. Anyway, after several uncomfortable minutes of divine fantasy, it's over, and a week or so later, they mail you the transcription. First, the document didn't sound anything like the sheet he was spouting. This thing is basically supposed to be a roadmap of your life. It started off saying, how great of a life I've had so far, loving and caring family, my dad was an asshole, meth user, literally never got along with him. We are cool now though. So, that first part was complete bullshit. Flag 1. It goes on to tell me which ancient tribe of Israel I belong to, and how I'm gonna get married, and have half a dozen kids, and have a fantastical, fulfilling life, but only if I go on a mission. Bottom line, it was a missionary recruitment contract. Mentions going on a mission half a dozen times, and contains facts about my life. That are complete hogwash points, so yeah, that was the oh shit moment. This caused me to reflect on the entirety of my experience growing up. In church, every single Sunday in uncomfortable clothes for an arduous 3 sheeting hours, we sat through sacrament meeting for the first hour. Basically the most boring activity ever contrived, where people stood at the pulpit giving talks or discussing church matters. During this, the young men, deacons, aged 13 to 15 walk around passing out bread and water to the congregation, which was prepared by the priests, 16 plus during a hymn. The second hour, we are split into classes, based on our age group, for another hour-long brainwashing seminar. The third hour we are split again, men in one class, women in another. To add to this, in high school, we had to attend seminary, which was an elective, which we did not get elective credits for, so I had to take an extra class every year to graduate. So every single day, we got an hour of Jesus pumped into us on top of church. Shouldn't be legal, emo. The icing on the indoctrination cake was something called the Pioneer Trek, which occurs every 4 years. All the youth with volunteer adults spend a few weeks building mother-faking Pioneer handcarts with giant metal wheels to be pulled manually with 1,000-pound payloads through the forest. This was the bane of my existence, which my parents forced me to participate in. They gathered us all up, we dressed in actual pioneer clothes, think Little House on the Prairie, to head up to the mountains. For several days, we were put into families assigned to a cart with all of our shit. No electronics allowed. We had to push and pull these cars, often off actual trails, through the woods for miles and miles. This took several days. At one point, we had to climb like a 50-degree incline up what I'd consider to be a cliff. We tied the obscenely heavy cart with ropes and pushed/pulled each cart up the hill. Very dangerous. Later on, the men were called away to the Mormon battalion, Civil War sheet, I think, and the women had to push the carts alone for a bit. Same sheet later on for the guys, but our trail was infinitely harder. It was freezing, hailing/raining during the men only push. Literally out the side of a cliff, over boulders and sheet, probably the hardest thing I've ever had to do. I was damp or wet, and freezing most of this trip. At night, only the women got tents, so I had to sleep by myself on a tarp that I folded over myself in an attempt to block the furious wind. I would not have been able to fall asleep, freezing as I was, if I wasn't so exhausted. I realize now that this entire event was contrived as an elaborate way to break the will and mind of the participants in order to fill the empty spaces with more and more Jesus, masquerading as a fun unity event. Point longer than I thought it was gonna be. Sorry, and I left out a lot. Back in the late 90s, some friends/coworkers of mine were involved with a local church that bordered on cult status. They kept trying to get me to go to one of their services with them, talking about how great the sermons were, how the community within Hebert was very welcoming, etc. I was agnostic at the time and skeptical because of a few things they also told me, but I went to check it out myself. At first everything seemed like any other church-friendly people, charismatic pastor, singing, praying, etc. But then I noticed things were weird when the pastor started speaking in tongues and the entire congregation did as well on cue. This happened at least 3 times during the service, and each time, everyone in the church besides me joined in. The church also encouraged all but forced young members to join their religion school to receive a degree in faith. The school was pretty expensive, around $2,000 in 1997, or about $3,100 today, which caused most members to take out a loan from the church to pay for. Members in their early 20s were not allowed to date or fraternize in any way with the opposite sex while in school. The church even rented out multiple apartments in a local complex where students were housed together. Non-members were not allowed to rent rooms or be in the apartment without a chaperone. I think what bothered me most was how intrusive the church was in these young people's lives. They required the members to report their incomes, demanded tithes, and regulated every aspect of the members' lives. The first Sunday when the time to go to the Kingdom Hall came and went, I asked my dad what was going on, and he said we are not going anymore. It was one of the best moments of my life. I felt both relieved and excited. I had always been bullied because I was so unworldly and shy, and although leaving the JWs didn't end the bullying, I was finally able to be a part of the outside world, which was wonderful. Before we left, my parents were very strict. We didn't celebrate Christmas, Easter, or birthdays. I wasn't allowed to go to other kids' parties either. When I was very small, a member of the congregation told me that Jehovah could hear and see all of my thoughts and would know if I had any bad thoughts. I wasn't allowed to listen to pop music or watch any TV shows or films that could be considered a bad influence. Example, the Night on Bald Mountain sequence from Fantasia, because it had demons in it. When the matriarch of the family passed, my paternal grandmother, the whole family stopped being witnesses. Our first Christmas was amazing. Things like a Christmas tree, decorations, and presents were a huge novelty. My parents went and bought so many tree decorations that you couldn't see the tree under them. I felt like an alien experiencing another culture for the first time. I'm a little late, but here it goes. My family and I shared a house with a group of nuns in the Philippines, a country deeply into their superstitions. The group leader, who we shall name Sister Teresa, would profess that either baby Jesus, adult Jesus, Father God, the Holy Spirit, and the Virgin Mary would consume/possess her. Never all at once, but either personality once every few weeks. Word got around, and people from the local parish would flock our house to experience the phenomenon. I even remember the Monsignor blessed our house and there would be celebrations on occasion. I was around 7 at the time and was involved in the choir. In truth, I enjoyed those times when people would gather and sing. That was the only thing that I took pleasure in, singing. The rest of it, I thought to be silly. One afternoon, I mimicked and made fun of Sister Teresa's shtick to my brother during our playtimes and our mom caught us. Since I was the instigator, my mom, who despite being a woman of science was a believer in all of this, told Sister Teresa one day that I was a doubting Thomas. So one random morning, during breakfast, Sister Teresa did her shtick and was going to prove to me that I was now talking to baby Jesus. Baby Jesus asked one of the nuns to get him a piece of Hershey's Kisses. He prayed over it before biting into the chocolate. He said something to me to the effect of "you will see." Then baby Jesus left Sister Teresa's body. She then showed it to me to take a look at the teeth marks on the chocolate, to which I remarked, "Why are they so big?" They all glared at me like I was Damien or something. But a year or so later, fewer and fewer people stopped coming. Sister Teresa frequented her province more and more until she completely moved out, although some of the nuns still lived with us. After going to church one Sunday, I asked my mom about her, and she looked at me almost embarrassingly and said she had a nervous breakdown. There was no single point I remember when I was very young asking my mom how we knew this religion was the right one and her telling me it was because it was the only one with a history of real miracles. Of course that history was only documented in the Bible, a logical fallacy I recognized on some level even then, but couldn't express. There was a weird moment when a lady in the church berated me for having a book with sorceress in the title and tried to convince me to throw it away. That whole thing left a discomfort I also wouldn't fully understand until I was older. It was high school that did it, and though learning about evolution and seeing how much sense it made prompted me to do some further research. Learning that there were active civilizations in the past when our doctrine claimed they would have been destroyed by the flood, and any questions I raised about that got hand waved by dating inaccuracies. Accounts like when Joshua stopped the sun having no parallels in other cultures. The whole logistical ridiculousness of the Ark story. It just didn't make sense. The final nail was when I got a girlfriend. We would do the whole horny teen routine and make out before we had to catch our buses, and a lady in the church saw us. The next time I attended, I was taken aside by some elders who tried to explain the errors of my ways. After that I was just fed up and stopped going. My mom didn't take well to that. It was a hard few years before I finally was old enough to leave. A lot of aggressions and running away from home, only to be dragged back by the cops. I left the day I turned 18. I told her that morning, and she didn't even look up from the TV, just said good luck.